They thought he was just another quiet man walking his old German shepherd along the river at dawn. No uniform, no badge, no reason to look twice. But what no one in Savannah knew was that he had once been trained to walk toward danger when everyone else ran. When a young waitress was cornered by men who made fear their business, and the city chose silence again, he faced a choice he'd been avoiding for years. Walk away, or break a promise he once swore he'd never ignore again. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Savannah, Georgia woke slowly, the way old cities do, as if time itself had learned patience from the moss-draped oaks and the weight of centuries. Dawn crept in over the river in pale gray layers, humid and heavy, pressing against skin before the sun ever showed its face. The air already carried heat, thick with salt and rust, and the faint sweetness of blooming magnolia. It was the kind of morning that promised exhaustion before noon, the kind that reminded people why Savannah had always been a place where beauty and hardship lived side by side. Ethan Cole walked the riverfront just after sunrise, when the cobblestones were still damp, and the tourists hadn't yet claimed the sidewalks. He moved with an economy of motion that stood out only if you knew what to look for. No wasted steps, no wondering gaze. His shoulders were broad but not bulky, the kind shaped by years of carrying weight rather than lifting it for show. At 6 feet tall, he wasn't imposing at first glance, but there was something grounded about him, something solid that didn't yield to the humidity pressing against everything else. His hair was dark brown, kept short and practical, already threaded with gray at the temples, despite him being only 41. A trimmed beard lined his jaw, neat but unstyled, softening the sharp angles of his face without hiding them. His eyes were a muted hazel, the kind that shifted color depending on the light, observant without appearing curious. They were eyes that had learned how much attention was too much. Beside him walked Rook. The German shepherd was large even for his breed, his black and tan coat thick and well kept, muscles visible beneath the fur when he moved. He was 8 years old, past the reckless energy of youth, but far from frail. His muzzle was beginning to gray, especially around the nose, giving him a permanently thoughtful expression. Rook walked half a step behind Ethan's left leg, close enough that their movements mirrored each other, as if connected by something invisible. His ears rotated subtly, tracking sounds Ethan didn't consciously register. He didn't pull on the leash, he didn't lag, he simply stayed. To most people passing by, Ethan looked like a man who had found a quiet routine and clung to it. He wore worn work boots, faded jeans, and a plain gray t-shirt that clung slightly to his back as the heat built. He worked at a small boat repair shop near the docks, sanding hulls and replacing rotted boards, a job that required patience more than conversation. The shop owner liked him because he showed up early, didn't complain, and didn't ask questions that didn't concern him. That suited Ethan just fine. He liked Savannah in the early hours because it hadn't yet decided what kind of day it wanted to be. Later, the city would bloom with sound, street musicians, tour guides reciting ghost stories, the constant churn of traffic. But for now, it belonged to the river and the people who needed silence to think, or to not think at all. Ethan stopped near the railing overlooking the Savannah River, resting his forearms against the cool metal. Cargo ships loomed in the distance, massive and indifferent, sliding past like slow-moving memories. Rook sat immediately, posture straight but relaxed, eyes scanning the waterline. A gull cried overhead, sharp and demanding. Ethan breathed in through his nose, exhaled slowly through his mouth. Mornings like this were easier, nights were harder. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams that felt less like memories and more like unfinished conversations. Sounds that didn't belong in his bedroom, faces without names. He'd learned not to fight them. Fighting made it worse. Instead, he let Rook ground him, let routine stitch the hours together. He hadn't always lived like this. There had been a time when mornings came with briefings instead of coffee, when the weight on his shoulders wasn't metaphorical. Back then, his movements had been sharper, his thoughts narrower. Purpose had been simple. Execute the mission, protect the team, come home if you could. Ethan Cole had been a Navy SEAL for nearly 12 years. He never talked about it. Not because he was ashamed, but because words had never done the experience justice. People either romanticized it or recoiled from it. neither reaction particularly useful. He'd learned early that silence was easier than explanation. There was one mission, there always is, that changed the way he saw the world. It wasn't the most violent. It wasn't the one with the highest stakes on paper. It was the one where hesitation had crept in unnoticed, where a moment of delay had cost someone else more than it cost him. The details blurred now, softened by time, but the lesson remained sharp. If you have the ability to act, and you don't, you carry that choice forever. That belief had shaped the man he became after the teams, just as much as the training had, shaped who he was during them. Rook shifted beside him, rising smoothly back to his feet. Ethan glanced down, a small smile tugging briefly at the corner of his mouth. Rook had come into his life during a stretch when the days felt heavier than usual. Officially, the dog had been assigned to him through a veterans program. Unofficially, Rook had saved him from drowning in his own thoughts. The dog wasn't overly affectionate. He didn't slobber or demand attention. He communicated in presence, in weight, in a quiet insistence on existing right where Ethan needed him. They understood each other, without performance. Ethan clipped the leash shorter and turned away from the river, heading toward the narrow streets that led deeper into the city. The sun was higher now, burning off the last of the morning fog. Sweat gathered at his hairline. Savannah was never gentle with those who lingered. Magnolia Bay Diner sat on the edge of the historic district, a low, sun-faded building with wide windows and a hand-painted sign that had been touched up so many times it barely resembled its original lettering. It had been there longer than Ethan had lived in the city, serving the same kind of food to the same kind of people. Dock workers, nurses coming off night shifts, locals who liked their coffee strong and their conversations optional. Ethan liked it because nothing about it demanded performance. He tied Rook's leash to the metal hook beneath his usual table outside, one shaded by a struggling awning. Rook lay down immediately, stretching out, head resting on his paws, eyes still alert. Ethan scratched behind his ears briefly before stepping inside. The diner smelled like coffee, grease, and familiarity. Behind the counter moved Lila Monroe. She was small, maybe 5'4", with a slim build that looked fragile until you noticed how quickly she moved. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy ponytail that refused to stay neat, strands escaping to frame a face that might have been pretty, if not for the tension that lived in it. Her skin was warm olive, her eyes a deep brown that seemed too serious for someone so young. She couldn't have been more than 23. Lila wore the same pale blue uniform every shift, the hem always a little wrinkled, the name tag slightly crooked. She smiled easily, but the smile didn't linger in her eyes. That part of her stayed guarded, watching, calculating. She was polite to everyone, friendly to most, and genuinely kind in a way that didn't invite questions. "Morning, Ethan," she said when she saw him, already reaching for a mug. "Morning," he replied, voice low and steady. She poured his coffee without asking how he liked it. He appreciated that. Some people tried to connect through small talk. Lila connected through consistency. As she set the mug down, Ethan noticed the faint tremor in her hand. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. He didn't comment. Commenting made people self-conscious. He simply nodded in thanks. "Kitchen's slow," she added, as if explaining something she hadn't been asked about. "Shouldn't be long, though." "No rush." She smiled again, then moved on, weaving between tables with practiced efficiency. Ethan took a sip of coffee and exhaled. Outside, Rook lifted his head briefly, tracking someone passing by, then settled again. The morning had settled into something almost peaceful. Almost. Ethan didn't know yet that this diner, this ordinary place stitched into his routine, was about to become the point where his carefully constructed quiet life cracked open. He didn't know that the promise he'd made years ago, one he thought belonged to another version of himself, was about to be tested again. For now, he was just a man drinking coffee in a city that hid its shadows behind charm and history, unaware that before breakfast was over, he would be forced to decide whether silence was still something he could live with. By the time the breakfast rush began to build, Savannah had fully decided what kind of day it wanted to be. The sun climbed higher, pressing heat down onto the streets until the air itself seemed reluctant to move. Inside Magnolia Bay Diner, the ceiling fans spun lazily, doing more for sound than relief, and the windows fogged faintly where cool air met humidity. Ethan sat at his usual table, coffee refilled once, toast untouched. From the outside, he looked relaxed, one arm resting on the table, shoulders slightly slouched in a way that suggested fatigue rather than readiness. But beneath that surface calm, his awareness stayed wide and quiet, like a net cast without effort. He wasn't watching anyone directly, yet nothing escaped his notice for long. Lila moved between tables with practiced speed, balancing plates along her forearm, her voice light and polite as she checked on customers. To most people, she looked like any other waitress navigating a busy morning. Only if you paid attention. Did you notice how she flinched almost imperceptibly whenever the front door opened? How her smile tightened before it softened? How her shoulders never quite dropped? Ethan noticed. He noticed because he had learned long ago that fear rarely announces itself. It hides in patterns, in tension held too long, in movements that anticipate trouble before it arrives. The bell above the diner door chimed. Lila's head lifted instantly, not dramatically, not enough to draw attention, but her spine straightened as if a wire had been pulled taut inside her. Her eyes flicked toward the entrance and then away just as quickly. Two men stepped inside. They were brothers, though nothing about them looked identical at first glance. The resemblance lived in the angles of their faces, the sharp cheekbones and narrow eyes that seemed permanently narrowed against the world. Both were in their early 30s, dressed casually but with intention, jeans clean, boots expensive enough to signal, money without advertising it. Men who wanted to blend in while still being recognized. The taller one was Caleb Reed. He had a trim beard that framed his mouth and a habit of smiling before speaking, as if rehearsing how charming he intended to be. His hair was light brown, worn longer on top, slicked back just enough to suggest effort. There was an ease to his posture, a confidence that came not from strength alone, but from believing he was untouchable. People like Caleb liked to talk. They liked to explain themselves. They liked to be seen as reasonable. Jonah Reed followed half a step behind. He was leaner, harder, his dark hair cut close to his scalp. He didn't bother with a full beard, just permanent stubble along his jaw that sharpened rather than softened his features. His eyes were a flat gray, unexpressive, scanning the room with quick, efficient movements. Where Caleb smiled, Jonah measured. Where Caleb leaned forward, Jonah positioned himself. Years earlier, Jonah had broken his nose in a bar fight that ended with another man hospitalized and no charges filed. Since then, he'd learned to let other people escalate while he stayed quiet. Together they moved with the ease of men who knew the rules would bend before they broke. The door closed behind them. The bell rang again. Normal sounds, normal movements, nothing that demanded attention. Ethan felt Rook shift outside, the leash tightening slightly before relaxing again. He didn't look down. He didn't need to. Caleb's gaze swept the diner and landed on Lila. His smile widened just a fraction, as if he had found what he was looking for. "Morning," he said, his voice carrying easily across the space as he approached the counter. Friendly, familiar, almost warm. "Morning," Lila replied automatically, though her voice pitched just a touch higher than before. She wiped her hands on her apron, a small, unnecessary motion. Jonah positioned himself near the end of the counter, angled so that he could see both the front door and the narrow hallway leading toward the kitchen. He leaned back slightly, arms crossed, one boot resting against the base of the counter. He didn't look at Lila directly. He didn't have to. Caleb rested his elbows on the counter, leaning in just enough to invade her space without making it obvious. "Busy today," he said lightly. "Looks like you're handling it all by yourself." "We're managing," Lila said. She reached for a coffee pot that didn't need refilling. Ethan watched the exchange in his peripheral vision. He didn't tense. He didn't move. Yet. He noted the distance between Caleb and Lila, the way her body angled away from him even as she faced him. He noted Jonah's position, how his presence subtly narrowed the room. This wasn't conversation. It was choreography. Caleb lowered his voice, not enough to hide it, just enough to make it feel private. "Didn't see you yesterday." Lila's fingers tightened. "Around the pot handle. I had the day off." Caleb nodded slowly. "Days off are nice. Everyone deserves a break." Jonah shifted his weight. The movement was small but deliberate, blocking the shortest path Lila could take toward the kitchen. The moment stretched. Ethan felt something settle in his chest, heavy but familiar, not anger, recognition. He had seen this shape of interaction in different places, under different languages, but the intent was always the same. Pressure applied gradually, just enough to remind someone of their place. Outside, Rook lifted his head again, ears rotating forward. Caleb smiled, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "We should talk later," he said. "You know, catch up." Lila swallowed. I'm working." "That's fine," Caleb replied. "We'll wait." Jonah's gaze finally lifted, locking on to Lila for the first time. There was no threat in his expression. That was the threat. Ethan's fingers curled loosely against the edge of the table. He took another sip of coffee, eyes still forward. Years ago, he would have already been on his feet. Years ago, action had been immediate, unquestioned. But this was not a battlefield. This was a diner. There were rules here, even if they were unspoken. He waited. Caleb straightened, tapping the counter lightly with 2 fingers. "See you in a minute," he said, and turned away, heading for a booth near the window. Jonah followed, taking the seat with a clear view of the room. Lila stood frozen for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Then she exhaled, long and shaky, and forced herself back into motion. Plates clinked, orders were called. The diner's rhythm resumed, but something underneath it had changed, like a note held just slightly off key. Ethan noticed her hands were shaking now. Not enough that anyone else would comment. Enough that she nearly spilled coffee as she passed his table. "You okay?" he asked quietly when she stopped to refill his mug. She hesitated. Her eyes flicked toward the booth by the window, then back to him. For a moment, something like honesty rose to the surface, trembling and uncertain. "I'm fine," she said finally. The words sounded rehearsed. Ethan nodded. He didn't challenge her. People didn't open up because they were asked. They opened up because they felt safe. He glanced outside briefly. Rook lay alert but calm, chin resting on his paws, eyes tracking the reflection of the diner windows. 8 years old, Ethan thought. Still sharp, still steady. Caleb laughed at something Jonah murmured, the sound loud enough to be noticed, too loud for the space. It was a performance, a reminder that they belonged wherever they decided to sit. Ethan didn't look at them, but he marked the laugh, the timing, the way Jonah's hand disappeared briefly beneath the table and re-emerged resting casually on his thigh. Whatever these men were doing, it wasn't finished. And neither, he realized, slowly, was he. He had come to Magnolia Bay Diner for routine, for the illusion that life could be reduced to manageable pieces. Coffee, toast, silence. But the city had a way of testing the stories people told themselves. Savannah hid its rot beneath charm, its cruelty beneath manners. Ethan finished his coffee and set the mug down carefully. Not yet, he thought, but soon. He didn't know what choice he would make by the end of the morning. He only knew that the day had already shifted, that the quiet he'd built his life around was thinning, stretched too tight to hold. And somewhere beneath the hum of fans and conversation, the question waited patiently for an answer. By late morning, the heat had turned Savannah into something dense and unforgiving, the kind of heat that pressed against the lungs and made even simple movements feel deliberate. Magnolia Bay Diner emptied in stages, the rush thinning into scattered conversations and clinking dishes. Caleb and Jonah Reed lingered longer than necessary, nursing refills they didn't want, occupying space the way some men occupied rooms, even when they were silent. Ethan paid his check and stood, moving with the same unhurried pace he'd used all morning. Outside, Rook rose the moment the door opened, stretching once before settling back into position at Ethan's side. The dog's tail flicked once, restrained, his attention still tuned toward the diner windows. Ethan clipped the leash and walked away without looking back, but he felt the weight of the room follow him out, like a gaze that didn't end when eyes turned away. Lila didn't watch him leave. She couldn't afford to. Her attention was fixed on the booth by the window, on Caleb's casual sprawl and Jonah's stillness, on the way their presence bent the air around them. When they finally stood and headed for the door, Caleb offered a lazy wave, a gesture so friendly it almost hurt. "Later," he said, as if it were a promise instead of a threat. The bell chimed. The door closed. The room exhaled. Lila leaned against the counter for a moment longer than necessary, palms flat, breathing shallow. The manager, a thin man named Harold Finch, with graying hair and perpetually hunched shoulders, glanced up from his clipboard. Harold had managed diners for most of his adult life, and believed survival came from not getting involved. He wore pressed slacks and a collared shirt even on the hottest days, as if formality itself might shield him. "You good?" he asked, not looking directly at her. "Yeah," Lila said. She straightened. "I'm good." Harold nodded, relieved, and returned to his paperwork. Problems in his experience only became real when acknowledged. Lila finished her shift an hour later. She changed quickly in the cramped back room, pulling on jeans and a loose cotton shirt, tying her hair back again even though it no longer mattered. When she stepped outside, The heat hit her full force. Savannah in the afternoon felt less like a city and more like a test of endurance. Her car was an old sedan with peeling paint and a stubborn driver's side door. She slid into the seat and sat for a moment before turning the key, forehead resting against the steering wheel. This was the part of the day she hated most, the quiet after, the space where thoughts caught up. The drive home took her past the river and through neighborhoods that changed block by block. Tourist charm gave way to cracked sidewalks and sagging porches. Spanish moss thinned, replaced by power lines and narrow streets. She parked in front of a modest duplex, paint faded to a pale yellow that might once have been cheerful. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and soup. Her father, Thomas Monroe, lay on the couch beneath a thin blanket, the television murmuring to itself. He was 62, but looked older now, his once broad frame reduced, his left side slack from the stroke that had taken more than his strength. His beard, once thick and dark, had gone mostly white, trimmed short out of habit, even though he rarely went anywhere. "You're late," he said, not unkindly. "Busy," Lila replied. She kissed his cheek and headed for the kitchen. She moved with efficiency born of repetition, checking pill bottles, setting out water, reheating soup. Caregiving had rewritten her days into lists and schedules. Thomas watched her with a mixture of pride and guilt. Before the stroke, he'd been a dock carpenter, hands calloused, shoulders knotted from years of honest work. He'd raised Lila alone after her mother left, teaching her how to fix things, how to stand her ground. Now he hated how much she carried for him. "They come by again?" he asked quietly. Lila's hands paused. No. It was a lie, but one she told gently. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the walls amber, a knock came at the door. Lila's stomach tightened before her mind could catch up. She wiped her hands and opened it. Mrs. Calder stood there, thin and sharp-featured, hair pulled into a severe bun. She was their neighbor, a woman in her 70s who watched the street like it was her personal responsibility. She held a small container. "Brought you some cornbread," she said. "Saw the boys earlier." "What boys?" Lila asked, though she already knew. Mrs. Calder's eyes flicked past her, scanning the street. "The ones who think this neighborhood belongs to them. You should be careful." "Thank you," Lila said. She accepted the container and closed the door, heart racing. The warning wasn't new. It was the confirmation that gnawed. Later that night, Lila lay awake listening to the city settle, sirens in the distance, a dog barking somewhere down the block. Her phone buzzed once on the nightstand. Unknown number. She stared at it until the screen went dark. Across town, Ethan worked late at the boatyard, finishing a hull repair by the light of a single bulb. His forearms ached, sweat streaking down his back. Physical exhaustion was easier than mental noise. Rook lay nearby on the concrete, chin on paws, watching shadows move. When Ethan finally locked up, he sat in his truck for a long moment before driving. The image of Lila's shaking hands replayed, uninvited. He told himself it wasn't his business. He'd told himself that before. It had never ended well. At home, a small house with creaking floors and minimal decoration, Ethan showered and fed Rook. The dog ate calmly, methodically, 8 years old and still precise. Ethan poured himself a glass of water and stood at the window, looking out at the darkened street. He thought of the promise again. He thought of the cost of keeping it. The phone rang at midnight. It was Lila. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady in a way that told him it hadn't been a spontaneous decision. "I'm sorry to call so late," she said. "I didn't know who else to call." Ethan didn't ask how she got his number. In small cities, information traveled faster than intention. "It's okay," he said. "What's going on?" "They said tomorrow," she said. "They want to talk. Alone." Ethan closed his eyes. Tomorrow. The word settled like a clock starting its countdown. "I don't want trouble," Lila continued. I can't keep doing this." "I know," Ethan said. Outside, Rook lifted his head, ears forward, sensing the shift. Ethan looked at him, then back at the dark street beyond the glass. "Get some rest," Ethan said. "We'll figure it out." After the call ended, he stood there a long time, the house quiet around him. He had not agreed to anything. He had not promised action, but he had not walked away either. And for the first time in years, he understood that the line he'd been avoiding was already behind him. Morning returned to Savannah without apology. The heat arrived early, thick and relentless, pressing down on the city like a held breath that refused to release. Ethan woke before his alarm, the room dim and quiet, Rook already alert at the foot of the bed. The dog's ears were angled forward, his dark eyes steady, reading the subtle shifts in Ethan's breathing the way he always did. 8 years old, seasoned and calm, Rook had learned the difference between a restless night and a decisive morning. Ethan sat up slowly, running a hand through his hair. He felt clear, not rested, but resolved in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Lila's voice from the night before lingered in his mind, not panicked, not pleading, but tired in a way that came from carrying too much for too long. Tomorrow, she had said, they want to talk, alone. The word alone had landed hardest. He dressed with care, not in anything tactical or deliberate, just clean jeans, a dark shirt, boots worn enough to look ordinary, the kind of clothes that didn't draw attention. He clipped Rook's leash and stepped outside into air already warm enough to promise discomfort by noon. The neighborhood was quiet, the street still empty, but Ethan's awareness extended beyond what he could see. He'd learned that danger rarely announced itself. It waited. They didn't go to the diner first. Instead, Ethan drove toward the river, parking near a stretch of public benches where fishermen sometimes gathered in the early hours. He sat with Rook beside him, watching the water move slow and steady. He wasn't stalling, he was thinking. In his years with the teams, decisions had often been made quickly, under pressure. This one was different. This one carried consequences that would ripple outward, touching people who had never agreed to be part of anything dangerous. He pulled his phone from his pocket and made a call he hadn't planned on making until it was already ringing. Marcus Hale answered on the third ring. Marcus was a retired sheriff's deputy who lived on the outskirts of Savannah, a man Ethan had met years ago through a veterans outreach program. Marcus was tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick gray mustache and a face carved by sun and years of disappointment in systems he'd once believed in. He spoke slowly, choosing words the way some men chose tools, careful and intentional. A departmental scandal involving ignored complaints and political pressure had ended his career early, hardening his distrust but sharpening his sense of right and wrong. "Cole," Marcus said, "you don't call unless something's off." "Something's off," Ethan replied. He kept his voice low, even. He didn't dramatize. He laid out facts, names, patterns, what he'd seen, what Lila had told him. There was a pause on the line. "You thinking of stepping in?" "I'm thinking of not letting it get worse." Marcus exhaled slowly. "Those boys won't stop on their own." "I know." "You need backup?" "Not yet." Another pause. "Then be careful, and don't be a hero." Ethan ended the call and stared at the river again. Hero. The word felt foreign, ill-fitting. He wasn't chasing recognition. He was responding to a line he couldn't unsee. Magnolia Bay Diner came into view an hour later. The parking lot was already half full, the breakfast crowd thinning into late-morning regulars. Ethan tied Rook to the familiar hook outside, but this time he didn't go in. He stood for a moment, watching the door, the windows, the reflection of passing cars. Rook remained standing, posture neutral but ready, his presence a quiet reassurance. Across the street, a man leaned against a lamppost, pretending to scroll on his phone. He was in his late 20s, with a shaved head and a sleeveless shirt that showed off muscular arms covered in faded tattoos. He watched the diner too closely to be casual. When Ethan's gaze met his, the man looked away too quickly. Ethan didn't stare. He filed the detail away. Inside the diner, Lila moved with her usual efficiency, but something about her was different today. Her shoulders were straighter, her movements more deliberate. Fear hadn't vanished, but it had shifted, hardened into something more purposeful. When she saw Ethan through the window, her eyes widened briefly, then softened. He gave her a small nod. Not reassurance. Acknowledgement. Caleb Reed arrived first. He pushed through the door with the same casual confidence as before, wearing a clean button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, forearms tanned and relaxed. His beard was trimmed neatly, his smile easy. He looked like someone who belonged wherever he decided to stand. He took a seat at the counter, drumming his fingers lightly. Jonah followed minutes later, slipping into the booth by the window, back straight, gaze already mapping the room. He wore a dark t-shirt, jeans, boots scuffed but solid. His jaw was clenched, stubble darker today, eyes sharp and unreadable. He didn't order anything. He didn't need to. Lila approached Caleb with a coffee pot. Her hand trembled once, then steadied. "What can I get you?" Caleb smiled up at her. "Thought we'd talk first." The room felt smaller. Outside, Ethan shifted his weight, adjusting Rook's leash. He wasn't inside, but he was close enough to hear raised voices if they came, close enough to intervene if necessary. He wasn't sure yet what necessary would look like. Caleb leaned in, lowering his voice. "We were patient," he said. "We still can be." Lila met his gaze. Her heart pounded, but she didn't look away. "I can't keep paying." Jonah's head lifted slightly. The movement was minimal, but the message wasn't. "End this now." Caleb's smile thinned. "Everyone pays," he said. "That's how this works." Lila swallowed. "Not anymore." The silence that followed was heavy, brittle. A fork clinked against a plate somewhere behind them. A couple at a nearby table glanced up, then down again. Jonah stood. He was fast but controlled, pushing back from the booth and stepping into Lila's space without touching her. He smelled faintly of tobacco and something metallic. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. That was when Ethan moved. He didn't rush, he didn't shout. He stepped through the door and into the diner, Rook at his side, posture calm but unmistakably present. Conversations faltered, heads turned, the air shifted. Ethan stopped a few feet away, positioning himself just enough to be involved. His voice was even, unraised. "She said no." Caleb turned, irritation flashing before he masked it with a smile. "This doesn't concern you." Ethan looked at him fully now. He saw the charm, the calculation, the assumption of control. He saw Jonah's stance, the readiness coiled beneath stillness. "It does," he said. "It concerns anyone who doesn't like bullies." Jonah's eyes flicked to Rook, assessing. The dog stood tall, black and tan coat gleaming, muscles defined, but still, ears forward. 8 years of training and partnership showed in the discipline of his posture. He was not a threat. He was a boundary. Caleb laughed softly. "You're outnumbered." Ethan didn't smile. "I don't need numbers." The moment stretched. This was the edge, the place where things tipped one way or another. Ethan felt the familiar narrowing of focus, the calm that came before movement. He didn't want violence. He wanted the threat to end. Jonah shifted his weight. Ethan saw it. Rook saw it. Time seemed to compress, not because it slowed, but because attention sharpened. Caleb raised a hand. "Relax," he said, though his eyes stayed cold. "We're just talking." Ethan held his ground. "Then talk somewhere else." For a heartbeat, it seemed like Jonah might push it further. Then something changed. Perhaps it was the attention of the room. Perhaps it was the certainty in Ethan's voice. Perhaps it was the quiet readiness of the dog beside him. Jonah stepped back. Caleb's smile returned, thinner than before. "This isn't over," he said, standing. He glanced at Lila, then at Ethan. "You just made it complicated." "Good," Ethan replied. They left without further incident, the bell chiming behind them. The diner exhaled collectively. Lila stood still, hands shaking, then slowly let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Ethan turned to her. "You did the right thing." She nodded, tears bright but unshed. "I was scared." "So was I," he said. Outside, Rook lay down again, calm, restored. The immediate danger had passed, but Ethan knew better than to believe it was over. Lines had been crossed, choices made, and some choices, once made, couldn't be undone. Savannah did not calm after the Reed brothers left the diner. If anything, the city tightened, as if it knew something unfinished had been set in motion. The afternoon heat thickened, clouds piling high and slow over the river, their shadows dragging across streets like warnings no one quite knew how to read. Ethan felt it as he walked Rook home, a pressure behind the eyes, a familiar sense that restraint was no longer neutral, it was a risk. Rook moved close to his left leg, his gait measured, shoulders rolling smoothly beneath his coat. Up close, the German shepherd looked every bit his age. 8 years, the edge of his muzzle silvered, the fur at his hips slightly lighter, where muscle met bone, but his posture remained unmistakably disciplined. He did not scan wildly, he tracked. Sounds, reflections in windows, the cadence of footsteps that didn't belong. He had learned that vigilance was quiet. Ethan unlocked his front door and paused before stepping inside, listening. The house smelled faintly of soap and wood, unchanged. He let himself in, secured the door, and set Rook's bowl down. The dog ate calmly, methodical as ever. Ethan poured water, drank, and leaned against the counter. The confrontation replayed, not the words, but the micro moments. Jonah's shift of weight, Caleb's smile thinning, the way Lila had held her ground even as fear trembled beneath it. He hadn't planned to step inside the diner. He'd told himself he would observe, keep distance, avoid escalation. Yet the moment Jonah closed that space, the line had moved. It always did. Waiting had its limits. The phone buzzed on the counter. A text from an unknown number appeared, brief and unadorned. Wrong place to make enemies. Ethan stared at it without reacting. He didn't reply. Messages like that were meant to provoke, to pull someone into a spiral of attention. He deleted it, knowing deletion didn't erase intent. He clipped Rook's leash again and headed out the back door, choosing movement over rumination. They drove toward the outskirts, where the city thinned into yards and low fences. Marcus Hale's place sat back from the road, a modest house with a wide porch and a gravel drive. Marcus was already outside when Ethan arrived, leaning against the railing with a mug in hand. In daylight, Marcus looked even more weathered. Sun-creased skin, forearms corded with old strength, mustache bristling like it had opinions of its own. He watched the road the way some men watched horizons. "You escalated," Marcus said without preamble. "I set a boundary." Marcus nodded. "Same thing, depending who you ask." They sat on the porch, Rook settling at Ethan's feet, chin down but eyes sore, eyes up. Marcus spoke of the Reed's pattern: pressure, retreat, retaliation by proxy. He'd seen it before. Men like Caleb didn't rush. They recruited inconvenience, flat tires, anonymous complaints. A message sent through someone smaller. "You protecting her tonight?" Marcus asked. "I'm making sure she's not alone." "That's a start," Marcus said, "but you can't be everywhere." Ethan knew that. He also knew waiting for a clean solution could cost more than acting. He thanked Marcus and left before dusk, choosing not to stay and debate what couldn't be debated away. Lila's shift ended early. Harold Finch had insisted, suddenly concerned with optics, which sounded a lot like fear in a pressed shirt. She walked home instead of driving, the sidewalks uneven beneath her shoes, her phone clutched in her hand. Every passing car made her heart jump. She rehearsed what she would say if she saw them again, knowing rehearsals never survived contact. She was 2 blocks from her duplex when she noticed the van. It was parked half a block ahead, white, unmarked, the kind that disappeared by being everywhere. The engine idled. The windows were tinted too dark for the hour. Her steps slowed. She considered turning back, then saw Mrs. Calder's porch light flick on across the street, a small island of illumination. Lila crossed quickly. The van door slid open. A man stepped out, not Caleb, not Jonah. He was shorter, stockier, mid-30s, with a shaved head and a goatee that framed a mouth perpetually downturned. His forearms were thick, veined, hands scarred. He wore a work jacket despite the heat. His name, though Lila didn't know it yet, was Eric Voss. He'd grown up bouncing between foster homes and learned early that belonging came with conditions. Loyalty, he believed, was transactional. "Evening," Eric said, voice casual. "We need a word." Lila backed toward the porch. "I said no." Eric smiled thinly. "Not my problem." A low sound rose behind Lila, not a growl exactly. More, a presence announced. Rook stepped into view beside Ethan, who emerged from the shadow of the oak lining the street. He hadn't been following her. He'd been waiting near the corner, timing his approach. The dog stood tall, head level, eyes fixed on Eric. The leash was loose. "That's far enough," Ethan said. Eric's gaze flicked from Ethan to the dog and back, recalculating. He'd dealt with men before, dogs too, but there was something in the stillness that unsettled him. The absence of threat theatrics. "Just talking," Eric said. "Not tonight." Eric's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the van, then back. "You think you won?" "I think you should leave," Ethan replied. Eric took a step back, palms up, playing the role. "This doesn't end." "It does if you stop," Ethan said. For a moment, it seemed Eric might test it. His shoulders rolled forward, weight shifting. Rook did not move. That restraint did the work. Eric cursed under his breath, retreated, slid into the van, and it pulled away with a surge of dust. Mrs. Calder's door opened. She stood framed by light, eyes sharp. "I called it in," she said. "Non-emergency, just in case." "Thank you," Lila whispered. Inside her house later, Lila shook as the adrenaline drained. Ethan stayed until her father settled, until the street went quiet again. They spoke little. Words felt unnecessary and inadequate. Driving home, Ethan felt the shift solidify. This wasn't going to resolve itself through distance. The Reeds had sent a message by proxy, testing the perimeter. Waiting now meant inviting escalation on their terms. At home, Ethan laid out options the way he used to lay out routes: what protected Lila, what exposed others, what forced the situation into daylight. He didn't want violence. He wanted witnesses, records, leverage. He wanted the quiet intimidation dragged into rooms it couldn't survive. He picked up his phone and drafted a message to Marcus. "They sent someone. I'm done waiting." Rook lay at his feet, breathing slow, steady. The dog trusted him to choose the moment. Outside, thunder rolled over the river, distant but approaching. Savannah braced, and so did Ethan. He understood now that restraint had served its purpose. The next step would require resolve, not reaction, and he was ready to take it. Savannah changed its tone the morning after the van appeared. The storm that had rolled in overnight scrubbed the air clean, leaving the city bright and sharp, sunlight reflecting off wet streets like exposed glass. Ethan noticed the clarity immediately. Clear days had a way of pulling hidden things into view. They made it harder for shadows to pretend they belonged. He moved early, not hurried, not secretive, deliberate. Rook stayed close, leash slack, paws quiet against the pavement as they walked the blocks around Magnolia Bay Diner. The dog's coat shone in the morning light, black saddle deep and glossy, tan legs corded with muscle that had learned patience over speed. At 8 years old, Rook carried himself with the confidence of experience. He did not posture, he assessed. Ethan didn't intend to spring a surprise. He intended to remove ambiguity. He stopped at a coffee shop 2 doors down from the diner and took a seat outside where he could see both entrances. From here, he could observe without lurking, be present without provoking. He ordered coffee and waited. Waiting, this time, was active. Across the street, a man loitered near a newspaper box. He was tall and lean, with a long face and a scraggly beard that looked like it had grown without guidance. His clothes were clean but mismatched, thrift store layers chosen for utility rather than style. He pretended to read headlines while watching reflections in the glass. His name was Paul Henley, and he made money as a lookout when rent came due. He had once been a deckhand before a back injury took him off the boats, and a painkiller habit took him off everything else. He avoided confrontation. He excelled at noticing. Ethan noticed him noticing. Inside the diner, Lila poured coffee with steady hands. Sleep had been scarce, but resolve had replaced some of the fear. She had spoken with her father that morning, honestly this time, and the weight of secrecy had eased, if only slightly. Thomas Monroe had listened without interruption, his lined face still, eyes dark with anger and concern. "You don't carry this alone," he had said, voice rough. "Not anymore." Harold Finch hovered behind the counter, jittery. He had installed a new security camera overnight, its small red light blinking with performative assurance. Harold told himself the camera meant he was doing something. He told himself many things. By mid-morning, the room filled with regulars, dock workers, retirees, a pair of nurses swapping stories over toast, ordinary witnesses. That mattered. Caleb Reed arrived just before 11. He wore sunglasses today, expensive and unnecessary indoors, removing them only after he took a seat at the counter. His smile was slower, more practiced. He scanned the room, clocked the camera, the crowd, the open windows. He liked control, not chaos. Jonah followed minutes later, taking the booth by the window. He sat with his back straight, hands folded, eyes moving. He clocked. Ethan outside almost immediately, his jaw tightened. Paul Henley shifted across the street, phone lifted, thumb moving. The trap didn't snap. It revealed itself. Ethan sipped his coffee and stood. He crossed the street openly and entered the diner with Rook at his side. The dog's presence rippled the room. Heads turned, conversations softened. Ethan stopped where he could be seen by everyone, not crowding, not challenging. He waited. Caleb spoke first, voice smooth. "Back again." "Looks that way," Ethan replied. Jonah's gaze flicked to Lila. She met it and did not look away. "This ends today," Ethan said. Not loudly, clearly. Caleb chuckled. "You're confused. You don't get to decide that." Ethan nodded once. "Actually, I do." Jonah stood. He didn't touch anyone. He didn't need to. "You think witnesses help you?" he said. "They don't." Ethan met his eyes. "They help the truth." Caleb leaned back, considering. He weighed options the way he always did, how far to push without breaking the surface. He gestured to the door. "Let's talk outside." "No," Ethan said. "We'll talk here." A murmur passed through the room. Harold Finch opened his mouth, then closed it. The camera's red light blinked. Caleb's smile hardened. "You're making a scene." "That's the point." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Jonah's hand slid into his jacket. Not fast, not hidden. Rook shifted. One step, no sound. A boundary drawn. Ethan's voice remained even. "Don't." Jonah froze. His fingers stilled. He looked at the dog again, then at the faces watching, then at the camera. The calculation changed. Outside, sirens approached. Not screaming, not urgent, but present. Marcus Hale's doing. He had called it in as a welfare check. A way to bring uniforms without lighting a fuse. Caleb exhaled through his nose. He stood. "This isn't finished." Ethan shook his head. "It is." Two officers entered, Officer Dana Ruiz and Officer Michael Trent. Ruiz was compact and athletic, her dark hair pulled tight, eyes sharp and attentive. Trent was broader, sandy-haired with a square jaw and a calm demeanor that came from years on patrol in neighborhoods that demanded steadiness. They took in the scene quickly, the crowd, the camera, the posture of the men involved. "Everything okay?" Ruiz asked. Ethan stepped back, opening space. Lila spoke. Her voice wavered, then steadied. She told them what had been happening. Names, patterns. She pointed to the camera. She gestured to witnesses. Caleb laughed once, sharp. "This is nonsense." Ruiz's gaze didn't leave him. "Sir, we're going to ask you to step outside." Jonah hesitated, then complied. Caleb followed, jaw tight. Paul Henley melted away across the street, unnoticed by most, noticed by Ethan. Statements followed. Phones came out. The red light blinked. The daylight did its work. By the time the Reeds left with the officers for further questioning, not arrested, not free, the balance had shifted. The diner buzzed with low conversation. Lila's knees trembled, then held. Ethan stayed until it settled. He didn't celebrate. He didn't posture. He paid his bill and nodded to Harold, who nodded back with the relief of a man who realized neutrality had been an illusion. Outside, Rook lay in the shade, breathing slow. Ethan knelt and rested a hand on the dog's neck. The fur was warm, solid, real. This wasn't over. He knew that. But the game had changed. The trap hadn't snapped shut. It had forced the threat into the open, where it could be seen, recorded, contested. Daylight was a weapon too. Ethan stood and walked away with Rook, the city bright around them. He had chosen exposure over secrecy, witnesses over whispers. Whatever came next would happen in rooms with doors and windows, and that was exactly where he wanted it. Savannah did not explode into action after the Reed brothers were taken in for questioning. It shifted instead, slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a tide changing direction long before the waterline moves. The city went on with its routines. Ships docked, tourists wandered, coffee brewed, but something beneath the surface had been disturbed, and people felt it in the way they watched doors a little longer and listened a little closer. Ethan felt it too. He woke early the next morning, the light cutting cleanly through the curtains. Rook was already awake, lying on his side but alert, tail giving a single thump against the floor when Ethan swung his legs off the bed. The German shepherd's coat caught the light, the black along his back glossy, the tan along his chest softened by age. At 8, Rook moved a fraction slower when he first stood, joints warming before strength returned, but his eyes were sharp as ever. Whatever yesterday had started, today would continue. The phone rang before Ethan finished his coffee. It was Officer Dana Ruiz. Her voice was professional but unguarded, the way it got when facts mattered more than protocol. "We had 3 calls overnight," she said, people asking how to file statements. 2 of them mentioned the diner. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Not relief, wait. "Are they safe?" "For now," Ruiz replied, "but they're scared. Some of this goes back years." "I figured." There was a pause. "Whatever you did," she said, "it made people think they wouldn't be alone." After the call ended, Ethan sat still for a long moment. This was the part he hadn't controlled. Exposure invited courage, but it also invited risk. Once voices began to rise, there was no putting them back where they'd been. Magnolia Bay Diner buzzed differently that morning. Not louder, not quieter, just charged. Conversations leaned toward the same subjects, drifting back whenever someone tried to change them. Harold, Finch hovered with a forced smile, his tie crooked, eyes darting between tables as if bracing for impact. The security camera blinked steadily. Gizaradi, a small mechanical witness that had become oddly comforting. Lila arrived early, her hair braided tightly today, as if order could be woven in. Her posture was straighter, though her hands still betrayed her nerves when she poured coffee. She wasn't pretending everything was fine. She was choosing to show up anyway. The first person to speak wasn't Ethan. It was Miguel Alvarez, a delivery driver who stopped in most mornings. Miguel was in his late 40s, stocky, with salt and pepper hair and a thick mustache that hid his mouth unless he smiled. He wore worn jeans and a reflective vest, his hands permanently stained with grease and ink from manifests. Years earlier, an accident on the docks had crushed 2 fingers on his left hand, leaving them stiff and slightly bent. Since then, he'd learned patience the hard way. He cleared his throat at the counter. "I talked to the police last night," he said, voice rough but steady, "about the guys who kept asking for route fees." The room went quiet. Miguel didn't look at anyone in particular. "I paid because it was easier," he continued, "because I didn't want trouble, but trouble came anyway." A woman near the window nodded slowly. She was Janice Holloway, a gas station attendant with tired eyes and a posture that suggested years of night shifts. She said nothing, but the way she folded her arms told a story of long-held resolve. Ethan sat in his usual place, not at the center of anything. Rook lay beneath the table, relaxed but attentive, his presence grounding rather than commanding. Ethan didn't speak. This wasn't his moment. Janice found her voice next. "They took money from me too," she said. "Said my place was out of the way. Said accidents happen." Others followed. A young barista, a dockhand. Stories overlapped, corroborated, filled gaps. The pattern sharpened. Fear loosened its grip as recognition took hold. People weren't isolated after all. They were connected by the same quiet threat. Outside, a patrol car rolled past slowly and parked down the block. Officer Michael Trent stepped out, hands resting lightly at his sides, posture open. He didn't come in right away. He waited. That restraint mattered. Later, Ethan walked Lila home. The sun hung high, heat pressing but honest. They didn't talk much. When they reached her porch, she stopped. "I didn't think anyone would follow," she said. "I thought they'd just go back to their lives." "They are," Ethan replied, "just not the same ones." That evening, more calls came. Marcus Hale updated Ethan on the reads, lawyers engaged, denials issued, but the questions kept coming. Records, patterns, names. The daylight trap had worked better than expected. The next morning brought rain again, soft and steady. Ethan drove to the docks for work, Rook riding shotgun, head near the open window. At the yard, men spoke in low voices, glancing toward him, then away. Not admiration, recognition. During lunch, Ethan received a message from an unfamiliar number. "I want to talk, not like before." It was signed Renee Parker. They met at a small park near the river. Renee arrived early, pacing. She was in her 30s, tall and slender, with sharp cheekbones and short-cropped hair dyed a faded red. Her clothes were practical, work pants, boots, a jacket despite the humidity. She worked security for a waterfront warehouse until she quit after refusing to smooth things over. The decision had cost her the job and her confidence. "They threatened my brother," she said, words tumbling out once she started. "He's 18. I paid so they'd stop." Ethan listened. He asked questions when necessary. He didn't promise outcomes he couldn't control. By the end of the week, there were statements, stacked thick enough to feel undeniable. Officer Ruiz checked in daily, her tone shifting from cautious to focused. The reads were no longer a rumor. They were a file. Lila stood taller with each passing day. The fear hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined her. She began sleeping through the night. Her father watched her, with a mix of worry and pride, recognizing the woman she was becoming. On Friday evening, the diner closed early. A storm brewed again, thunder low and distant. Ethan sat on the porch of his house. Rook stretched beside him, rain cooling the air. He felt the familiar pull of vigilance easing, replaced by something steadier. This was what followed action. Not applause, not closure, but voices. Messy, imperfect, human voices choosing to be heard. Ethan understood then that the moment at the diner had not been the turning point. It had been the invitation. And people had accepted it. Savannah greeted the morning after justice quietly, as if it understood that some victories deserved calm rather than noise. The air was cooler than it had been in weeks, the storm having carried away the heaviest heat. Sunlight filtered through the oaks along the streets, catching on Spanish moss and turning it silver. The river moved with its usual patience, indifferent to human struggles, yet somehow bearing witness to them, all the same. Ethan woke just before dawn, not from tension this time, but from habit. Rook lay stretched beside the bed, his breathing deep and even, paws twitching faintly in a dream. The German shepherd was showing his age more clearly now, his joints stiff for the first few steps, his muzzle more gray than black, but his presence remained constant, a steady anchor in a world that had finally begun to slow. They walked the riverfront as they always did. The cobblestones were still damp, the city hushed except for distant gulls and the low hum of a tugboat. Easing into the harbor, Ethan felt something unfamiliar in his chest as he moved. Not vigilance, not anticipation, but relief. Not the kind that erased memory, but the kind that allowed it to rest. News had traveled fast the night before. Caleb and Jonah Reed had been formally charged. Extortion, coercion, intimidation. More charges were pending. The statements had stacked too neatly to ignore, corroborated by footage, timestamps, patterns that refused to be dismissed as coincidence. The daylight trap had done its work. The game the Reeds had controlled in shadows had not survived exposure. Ethan hadn't gone to the station. He hadn't been asked to. His role, it seemed, was finished. That was how he preferred it. Magnolia Bay Diner opened early, the bell above the door chiming with a note that sounded almost lighter than before. Ethan tied Rook's leash to the familiar hook beneath the awning and stepped inside. The smell of coffee greeted him, rich and grounding. Lila was already there. She looked different, though it took a moment to understand why. Her hair was still neatly braided, her uniform the same pale blue, but her posture had changed. She stood taller, shoulders back, movements unhurried. The tension that had once lived permanently in her expression had softened, replaced by something quieter and stronger. "Morning," she said, smiling fully this time. "Morning," Ethan replied. She poured his coffee without asking. Her hands were steady. At a corner booth, Miguel Alvarez sat laughing with Janice Holloway, the sound easy and unguarded. Nearby, Renee Parker sipped tea, her posture relaxed for the first time since Ethan had met her. Even Harold Finch looked different, his tie straight, his movements purposeful rather than anxious. He caught Ethan's eye and nodded, a small acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude. Outside, Rook lay on his side beneath the table, eyes closed, completely at ease. The dog had not slept like this in public for years. Lila returned with toast and set the plate down carefully. "They came by last night," she said quietly. Ethan looked up. "The police?" She nodded. "They wanted to follow up, asked if I needed anything." She paused, then smiled again. "I said no. For the first time, I meant it." He nodded once. "Good." Later that morning, Ethan drove Lila home, not because she needed protection, but because routines were being rewritten, and some habits were worth keeping. Thomas Monroe waited on the porch, wrapped in a light jacket despite the mild weather. He looked thinner than he once had, but his eyes were sharp, proud. "You're the one," Thomas said, extending a hand to Ethan. His grip was weaker than it would have been years ago, but deliberate. "Thank you." Ethan shook his hand. "She did the hard part." Thomas smiled at his daughter. "That sounds right." Across town, Officer Dana Ruiz finished filing paperwork that felt different from the usual. This wasn't just a case closed, it was a pattern broken. She stood at her desk, dark hair loose now that the shift was nearly over, scanning the city through the precinct windows. She had learned early in her career that most injustice survived on isolation. Today had proven what happened when that isolation cracked. Officer Michael Trent passed by, coffee in hand. "Community meeting tonight," he said. "Big turnout." Ruiz nodded. "Good." That evening, the meeting filled a small community center near the docks. Folding chairs scraped against the floor as people settled in. Delivery drivers, service workers, retirees, young faces and old. Ethan stood at the back with Rook, who lay down without prompting, content to observe. People spoke, not all of them eloquently. Some with shaking voices, some with anger, some with tears. But they spoke. Names were said out loud, experiences shared, connections made. Fear, once private and suffocating, was redistributed into something lighter, shared, manageable. Ethan did not speak. He wasn't asked to. When someone tried to thank him publicly, he shook his head gently. The attention shifted, as it should have, back to the people who would carry this forward. Weeks passed. The Reed brothers remained in custody as cases progressed. The city adjusted. Small businesses installed cameras. Workers shared numbers. People checked in on one another more often. It wasn't utopia. It was vigilance with neighbors. Lila enrolled in evening classes at the local community college, not because she had to escape her job, but because she wanted options. She still worked mornings at the diner, still poured Ethan's coffee when he came in, but her future had widened. Thomas's health stabilized. He spent more time on the porch now, watching the street, greeting passersby with the nod of a man who had been returned to the world. Ethan returned to the boatyard full-time. The work was the same: wood, water, patience, but it felt lighter. He slept through most nights. When memories surfaced, they did not drag him under. One morning, 3 months after the diner confrontation, Ethan sat at his usual table by the window. The city hummed gently outside. Rook lay beneath the table, asleep again, dreaming of nothing urgent. Lila brought coffee and lingered. "I'm moving soon," she said. "Just across town, closer to school." "That's good," Ethan said. She hesitated. "Will you still come by?" He smiled faintly. "Probably." She laughed softly. "I thought so." When she walked away, Ethan looked out at the river. He thought of the promise he'd made long ago, under different skies, when hesitation had cost more than he could name. He had believed for years that redemption had to be loud, dramatic, earned through sacrifice. He understood now that it could also be quiet. It could be a morning decision, a refusal to walk away, a dog lying peacefully at your feet. Ethan finished his coffee and stood. Rook rose with him, stretching once before settling into stride. They stepped out into Savannah's gentle light, moving forward without urgency. The city went on, and so did they. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or blinding light. Sometimes, they arrive quietly. In the moment, someone chooses not to walk away. In the steady presence of a loyal dog standing between fear and harm. In the courage of people who believed they were invisible until they weren't. Some may call it coincidence, but those who believe in God know this truth. Nothing happens by accident. God does not always perform miracles by changing the world around us. Sometimes he performs them by moving a heart, by placing the right person in the right place at the right moment, by offering second chances to the forgotten. You may not face danger like this today, but perhaps you are carrying a quiet fear, a silent burden, a moment where staying silent feels easier than doing what is right. If this story touched your heart, remember this: everyday courage is where miracles begin. Please share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment if you still believe kindness and faith matter in this world. And subscribe to this channel so we can continue sharing stories of love, courage, and healing. May God bless you and your family. May he protect every child, every vulnerable soul, and every animal who cannot speak for themselves. And may he give us the strength to become the answer to someone else's prayer, even when we don't realize it. Amen.